Do you like rum? Well, I sure do, and whenever I hit up the bar and order a glass, it is rare to not see it poured from a bottle of Captain Morgan. The sanguine-swathed swashbuckler, standing one knee on a keg of presumable kill devil, cutlass impaling the sand, a pair of them crossed behind him. His cloak flutters with the wind, and he boasts a devilish grin, knowing well that he'll be piss-drunk and drooling in a gutter by the end of the evening. Oh, the adventures we've had. I only feel sorry for my liver. The Captain Morgan character is so ubiquitous that when I had a pirate-themed birthday party as a kid, I think I was 8, we removed the labels off these bottles of raspberry soda and made our own ones with crudely drawn Captain Morgans on them. When we took the bottles out for the party, one of them had huge clumps floating around in it. And that was absolutely disgusting. Reminds me of the anecdote from the water video, when the sailors found a beer barrel full of clumps. Yeah, we decided to dump it. It wasn't up to the captain's standard. Mostly known by the rum today, the character is based on the real-world Sir Henry Morgan, the most successful buccaneer of the 17th century. It is not entirely inappropriate that he's remembered through a rum brand. The historical Morgan rose from humble origins to become Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, knighted by the king himself and owning several sugar plantations. Some of his produce was likely used in the production of rum. While most buccaneers prefer to spend their ill-gotten gains on wine and women, Morgan consolidated and used the chaos of the Caribbean to climb the social ladder. Few men shared his talent, calculation, luck, and ruthlessness. For the New World was a violent place, and fortunes made at the end of a musket. This is the true story of Henry Morgan. He wasn't born a Sir, nor was he born a Henry, his birth name being Harry Morgan, and hailing from the Welsh Principality. Most of his friends and supporters would lovingly know him as Harry. It seems that he was born in 1635, because in 1671 he claimed to be 36 years old. His lineage is more complicated and has never been firmly established, only that he was related to the illustrious Morgans of Tredegar. In 1672, its title holder, William Morgan, referred to Harry as a relation and formerly near neighbor. It is believed that Henry came from an illegitimate or cadet branch of the Morgans, his father being a certain Robert. It is believed that he was either born in the villages of Pencarne or Llanrhymni, a name he would later give to his favorite estate on Jamaica. The family was of a military background. 3 generations prior, Colonel Thomas Morgan was knighted after service fighting the Spanish. His nephews, the 2 uncles of Henry Morgan, fought as mercenaries in Germany and the Low Countries, before partaking in the English Civil War. Henry Morgan was only 7 years old when this conflict broke out. We know next to nothing about his childhood, apart from what he said himself in a letter written in 1680. I left school too young to be a great proficient in that or other laws, and have made more use to the pike than the book. However, it is a vague comment part of a correspondence to the Lords of Trade and Plantations in London, and some context might be missing. But if taken at face value, it indicates that Morgan joined the army at a young age. The Civil War ended in 1651, when he would have been 16, so he could have partaken for at least a few years. Soldiers in the conflict could be quite young. George Villiers, the 2nd Duke of Buckingham, joined the conflict in 1643, aged 15. Even at a younger age, say between 10 to 14, Morgan could have been a servant, messenger, or even a drummer boy. Even if we know next to nothing about the young Harry Morgan, we do have a portrait that is allegedly of him. It now hangs at Tredegar House. The soft skin and slight chubbiness of the teenager makes him seem like the noble son that would leech off his father and chase after girls, had it not been for the cool measurement in his eyes, calculating, uninnocent. Like so many families during the Civil War, the Morgans were split. Thomas Morgan served with the parliamentary forces of Oliver Cromwell and rose to the rank of Major General. With the parliamentary victory, he became a trusted subordinate of the Lord Protector and his closest general, George Monk. Thomas's cousin, Edward, wasn't so lucky. Having sided with the king, he fled into exile. Henry Morgan and his family were part of the unfortunate royalists, but they had not the luxury to escape, and were heavily reduced by the king's defeat. In 1655, an entry in the Bristol Apprentice books reveals that he, Henry Morgan of Abergavenny, labourer, was sold to Timothy Townsend of Bristol, a cutler. His term was to last 3 years in Barbados, and so he gained entry to the New World. For a man of noble origins, it was a shameful background, and Morgan would vehemently deny it. When one of his surgeons, Alexander Exquemelin, later published an account of their adventures in which the story of Morgan's indenture was relayed, Morgan sued the publishers of the English version. Morgan may have been right. Some allege that he wasn't indentured, but joined the West End Design of 1655. This was an English expedition sent to conquer the island of Hispaniola. According to Dudley Pope's 1978 biography on Henry Morgan, he joined this expedition as an ensign. Pope seems to lack any source to this claim. Jonathan Riley's The Colonial Ironsides from 2022 is a very thorough compilation on the structures of this expedition, including an appendix of all the officers and ensigns. Morgan is entirely absent from it. He is likewise absent from the list of officers in the Occupation of Jamaica. Now, is this definite evidence that Morgan didn't partake in the West End Design? Maybe not. Maybe he partook in the general rank and file, but so far we have more period documentation, the Bristol Apprentice books, pointing to Morgan coming to the New World as an indentured servant. His partaking in the West End Design would have been very convenient, as it would have schooled Morgan in Caribbean warfare, and taught him how to lead a campaign and what mistakes he shouldn't make. The expedition was poorly supplied, had insufficient intelligence, fought in a rigid manner, and was easily ambushed and overpowered by the Spanish troops, who were more suited for the local climate. Most of the men died of disease caused by bad provisioning. The Buccaneers would learn from these mistakes, and Henry Morgan would later lead his forces in a way that seemed tempered by said mistakes. But veterans of the design were everywhere in the Caribbean, and he could simply have picked it up from them or general hearsay. And by the time of his ascendance, he wouldn't be short on experience anyway. If you want to learn more about the design, I recently published a video on it. Morgan's contract bound him to indenture for a 3-year period, and if Exquemelin is to be believed, he left for Jamaica as soon as his term concluded. This was the prime destination for any ambitious military man in the Caribbean. Morgan likely arrived in 1658 or 59, less than 5 years after the English conquered the island. There was an ongoing guerrilla war with the Maroons, and privateers were freely given commissions to go and plunder from the Spanish. Opportunity was there for the man who could take it. Indeed, in 1661, Governor D'Oyly detained 25 pirates for attacking an innocent Dutch vessel, one being a certain Henry Morgan, soldier. His listing as a soldier does perhaps indicate that he was part of the West End Design, but it could also mean that he became a soldier after his term as a servant. Anyway, the pirates were released with a slap on the wrist, since D'Oyly was dependent upon them for the island's protection. You see, the disastrous West End Design abandoned Hispaniola and conquered Jamaica instead, using a substantial army and large fleet. Almost as soon as the island's taking, most of the soldiers and the entire fleet just up and left, leaving the young colony to fend for itself. There were few incentives for soldiers and sailors to stay, apart from the prospects offered by piracy. So, in order to keep a semi-permanent garrison of fighting men and veterans, the governors had to encourage piracy and give them space on Jamaica to spend their loot and repair their ships. In the previous year, 1660, Jamaica received the news that the monarchy had been restored. Morgan's family was to benefit from it directly. Uncle Edward returned from exile, and although Uncle Thomas had served under Cromwell, his friend and superior, General Monk, was the one responsible for inviting the king back home after Cromwell's death, ensuring his and Thomas' positions in the new order. As for Henry, it is difficult to say if he would have fared much better or worse under a continued Commonwealth. He was starting a new life in the Caribbean, and politics at home may not have changed it too much. However, we can notice subtle benefits in the current and the future. For one, the Jamaican government was reformed, a royal governor instituted, along with a council of 12 members. Morgan was friends with several of the councilmen, Thomas Ballard, Samuel Barry, and Henry Archbold, so the reform gave him an early foot into politics. When the new governor arrived, he renamed the capital of Caguay to Port Royal, disbanded the local army, and reformed it into a militia. Henry Morgan reappears in the records, appointed as captain of the Port Royal Regiment. To achieve this position, he must have spent the last few years accruing experience and at least some wealth. He also possessed a small vessel, likely a bark or piragua, and a privateering commission for it. Officially known as a commission for a private man of war, this was essentially a naval mercenary contract that allowed you to attack England's enemies and sell their ships and cargo. In other words, legalized piracy. Indeed, this practice was so prevalent on Jamaica that it is during this period that the word private man of war turns into privateer, since there was now a real need for distinguishing them from illegal pirates, and the struggles of Morgan and his men were as much fought in the dictionaries and courtrooms as they were on sea and land. Morgan's explosive career played a huge role in ironing out the definition between the privateer, a patriotic servant of the crown, and the pirate, a self-serving criminal. If you wish to learn more about this development, my video on the Buccaneers covers it rather extensively. The new governor arrived with a cessation of privateering, but since both the Jamaican economy and defense was dependent on this practice, he decided to tacitly continue the sponsorship of it. The Spanish refused any offers of peaceful commerce, so a fleet was dispatched under Commodore Christopher Mings to attack the nearby port of Santiago de Cuba. Morgan and his vessel were part of that fleet. They captured next to no plunder, but the city was so crippled that it couldn't pose a serious threat to Jamaican security. In that regard, the raid was a success. Mings did not stay in Jamaica for long, and departed next to Campeche. Morgan accompanied him, and Mings could be considered Morgan's mentor. He would pick up some of his tactics and leadership abilities, most prominently the elements of speed and surprise. Mings preferred to capture a target unaware, and then move on to the next before it could be alerted. Morgan would make great use of this principle in his next campaign. When the fleet returned to Jamaica, Morgan and 4 other captains decided to outfit their own expedition, departing in November of 1663. They would not return for 1.5 years. Notable is that all of these captains were younger and more inexperienced, and several of them would accompany Morgan in his future campaigns, most prominently John Morris. Though they couldn't amass the same number of men as Mings, they counted perhaps 200 compared to Mings' 1,300, but they did have tactics on their side. They wanted to attack some place that hadn't been assaulted recently, and would thus be unprepared for their coming. The small fleet made it back to the Gulf of Campeche, where they captured an 8-gun frigate. On the 19th of February, 1665, they landed at the mouth of the Grijalva River and rode to Villahermosa de Tabasco. At 4 o'clock in the morning, they took the city while most of the inhabitants were sleeping. Plunder and captives were herded back downriver, where they discovered their ships taken by a Spanish patrol. The Buccaneers were forced to release their hostages and moved westward, hoping to find another escape. On the 17th of March, they were overtaken by the Spanish Coast Guard and 300 militiamen. The commander, Jose Aldana, asked the Buccaneers to surrender. They pretended to not understand him. He was speaking Spanish and stuff. When an interpreter arrived the next morning, they basically told him to come and get it. This whole thing about not understanding Aldana was likely a ruse to buy time, for when the Spanish disembarked, they found their enemy entrenched behind a palisade, reinforced with sandbags and 7 small cannons. Though the Spanish outnumbered them, they were easily repelled. The next day, the Spanish ships ran aground, allowing the Buccaneers to escape. The Buccaneers proceeded along the coast, taking small boats and making minor descents to gather provisions. They rounded Yucatan and proceeded as far south as Roatan, where they took on water and continued to Trujillo. The port was captured without much of a fight, and native guides were employed to take the fleet into Lake Nicaragua. Though accessible by a river flowing into the Caribbean, the lake was located inland and thought safe from piratical incursions. The pirate ships were hidden at the mouth of the river. They had learned from their previous mistake and continued upriver in canoes. The city of Granada was taken entirely by surprise. The Buccaneers attacked in at night and captured the governor and his officers in their beds. For 16 hours the settlement was plundered, and all of the boats were sunk to prevent a pursuit. Continuing around the lake, they captured a small ship and another town, before returning to their ships on the Caribbean coast. After 1.5 years, it was finally time to return home. During Morgan's absence, there had been some political developments on Jamaica. The previous governor had been replaced by Sir Thomas Modiford, a Barbadian sugar planter who had played the parliamentarians and royalists against each other, all to his own benefit. He was accompanied by the lieutenant governor, now a familiar face to us, Colonel Edward Morgan, uncle of Henry. His years of exile had rendered him destitute, and he was hoping to build a new life on Jamaica together with his 2 sons and 4 daughters. His wife had sadly died shortly before departure, and his eldest daughter passed during the crossing. Edward and his son, Charles, set about clearing land and building a plantation, where they were frequently visited by Colonel Archbold, Henry's friend. All of this consolidated Henry Morgan's standing in Jamaican society, and we can see how he indirectly benefited from the Restoration. Modiford wanted to quell privateering and expand the sugar and slave trades, but he also feared that a suppression would scare them away, not only rendering Jamaica susceptible to Spanish piracy, but also piracy from its own former privateers. Modiford also knew that sugar planting was expensive to get into. It took several years to reap a net profit, and you needed a base economy which most colonists didn't have. They could only acquire this money by taking it from the Spanish. A middle ground was reached when war broke out with the Dutch, allowing the government to redirect its privateers from illegal war on the Spanish to legal war against the Dutch. Edward Morgan himself departed on a cruise against them. When news finally arrived of Henry's campaign, it received some mixed receptions. Those who desired trade with the Spanish were concerned, but there were a great many people who still hated the Spanish, and they rejoiced. As soon as the Buccaneers returned, they were given an audience with Governor Modiford. They related the story of their campaign and told him that they had no idea of the peace between Spain and England, since they had been at sea for so long. This was likely a trick, and the Buccaneers had probably stayed away from Jamaica for so long because they did not want to return without significant booty, and if they returned, they'd be told to stay. The Spanish had likely told them of the truce. Morgan and his fellow captains spent the next few weeks partying, except for one of the Dutch captains, Martin. Since England and the Netherlands were at war, the Dutchman sailed to Tortuga instead. It wouldn't stop Morgan from working with the Dutch in the future. But for now, he had other matters to attend to. Ties were established with his recently arrived family. Now at the age of 30, he married one of Uncle Edward's daughters, Mary Elizabeth, his cousin. If it was a marriage of politics or passion, we cannot be certain. Edward and his daughters had no money to speak of, but Henry and Mary would never have any children. As for Colonel Edward himself, he perished during an attack against the Dutch. Not owing to any combat wounds, but his weight. He was quite corpulent at this point, with most sources saying that he perished from the heat and exhaustion. Mary's sister got married to another friend of Henry, Robert Bindless, further expanding his circle of associates. For the rest of Morgan's life, Bindless would follow him as a close friend and political ally. He spent the coming few months on land, mostly assisting his cousin and brother-in-law, Charles Morgan, with expanding the family plantation. He soon acquired his own, and was setting himself up as both a gentleman and Jamaican socialite. It seemed like Morgan was destined for retirement, if Modiford had not had troubles with the island's defense. He wanted to rally the Buccaneers against the Dutch, but they saw them as a religious ally, preferring to attack the Catholic Spanish instead. Many had now departed Jamaica for prospects elsewhere, and the Port Royal militia had shrunk from over 1,000 men to a mere 150. Modiford directed Henry Morgan to refurbish the militia, and managed to convince the Buccaneers to attack Curaçao, the Dutch capital in the Caribbean. However, the Buccaneers, having elected a man named Mansfield as their admiral, decided to attack the Spanish instead. Specifically, the island of Santa Catalina, once a Puritan colony called Providence. As it was situated much closer to the Spanish Main, it was believed to be a better base of pirating operations. Though Providence was taken and garrisoned, Modiford did not give Mansfield a warm reception, and the old pirate soon perished of his advanced age. Providence was retaken by the Spanish and the prisoners kept under deplorable conditions, several of said prisoners being Jamaican gentlemen. News of their treatment coincided with a report that Modiford's own son, Jack, had fallen in combat with the Spanish. In 1667, Spain and England signed a peace treaty, but there was no mention of free trade or Jamaica being recognized as English territory. Combined with the rumors of a Spanish invasion, sentiment against them was growing. Modiford and his council decided to assemble a fleet, with Morgan assigned as the admiral. He was directed on a reconnaissance mission to Cuba, but it soon developed into something more aggressive. Morgan assembled a sizable fleet, consisting of old friends like John Morris and his son, and Captain Edward Collier. He was joined both by English and French buccaneers, amassing a force of 700 men and a dozen ships, departing in March of 1668. On the 28th, he landed in the Gulf of Anna Maria, marching his army inland to the town of Puerto del Príncipe, now called Camagüey. When the council were discussing their plans aboard the flagship, a prisoner overheard them, jumped overboard, and swam ashore. They mistakenly believed he could not understand them, but he did, and Príncipe had soon been alerted. Most of the denizens evacuated the town with their treasures, and the governor assembled a militia of 800 men. It served as an important lesson to Morgan, never to allow his plans to leak out. Knowing the Spanish had likely prepared ambushes, he marched his men through the terrain instead of taking the road, and patrols were sent ahead to capture enemy scouts and civilians, preventing them from sending alarm and using them as guides. When the opposing forces met in the open field, Morgan repelled the Spanish cavalry by forming his men into a semicircle. The rest were easily repelled by the Buccaneers' superior firepower, and after inflicting heavy casualties, the city was taken. After several days of failed negotiations, Morgan could only claim a small bit of plunder, with the Spanish giving him 1,000 cows for leaving the city intact. Morgan had the bovines butchered, salted, made into provisions. Yummy. For Modiford, the attack was surely a success. Morgan claimed that the Cubans had planned an attack on Jamaica, and his assault served as a preemptive strike. For the Buccaneers, it was a failure. They didn't get enough booty, and most of the Frenchmen left him to try their luck with François L'Olonnais. As for Morgan, his own intentions are uncertain. The commission was somewhat vague, but seemed to have been restricted to Cuba. Yet, he decided next to attack the Darien Isthmus, which is on the other end of the Caribbean Sea, indicating that he did have monetary interests. With his force now reduced to 460, Morgan and his men made way to Naos Bay, where he anchored his ships and rowed by canoe to the city of Portobelo, a silver entrepot. It is also where Francis Drake had perished some 70 years prior. Morgan was joined by Englishmen who had escaped Spanish captivity after being taken at Providence, and they provided him with valuable intelligence. Portobelo was defended by 3 large castles, and Morgan began his assault by attacking one of them, San Jeronimo. After the castle refused to surrender, Morgan and his men swarmed the gates, and within half an hour, everyone inside had been killed or subdued. In the dungeons they discovered more English prisoners, and stories of their treatment likely inspired the Buccaneers to avenge themselves on the Spanish enemy. The poor treatment of the prisoners would serve as justification for the attack, in hindsight at least. They proceeded next to the city itself, spreading terror by firing at everything alive, men and women, animals, so capturing the city without a fight. Most of the denizens fled into the central citadel of Castle Triana. Since the castle was located right in the center of town, the Buccaneers climbed the buildings surrounding the castle and used them as vantage points for firing onto the battlements. They attempted to burn the gates with their fireballs, think Molotov cocktails, but the Spanish repelled them by throwing down stones. Morgan then rallied a group of captives, including the mayor, 2 friars, several women and nuns, using them as a meat shield for the forlorn hope, as they advanced on the walls with torches, ladders, and axes. The defending governor fired on the meat shield nonetheless, wounding 2 friars and killing an Englishman, but not preventing them from breaching the gates. With the garrison distracted, another party scaled the walls with ladders, planting a red flag on the ramparts and rushing inside. 45 defenders out of 80 perished, and the rest were wounded. Now, this story of the meat shield was most famously relayed by the aforementioned Alexander Exquemelin, and when Morgan sued the publishers of Exquemelin's English account, he demanded the retraction of this incident as a falsehood. Many historians have sided with Morgan, usually in attempts to clear his reputation. Exquemelin did certainly invent many falsehoods on Morgan, but I do not think this was one of them. In the 5th chapter of Peter Earle's The Sack of Panama, detailing the sack of Portobelo, the people of the meat shield are specified as previously listed, whereas Exquemelin merely called them religious men and nuns. Looking at Earle's notes, he basically says that he got this information from several Spanish accounts of the attack, most prominently the one by Don Agustin de Bracamonte. It is doubtful that Exquemelin had access to Spanish government records, meaning that he probably got the information from a different source. Morgan's use of the meat shield was likewise mentioned by one of his veterans, when he likened it to a meat shield they later deployed in the Battle of Arica, 1681. So it seems we have 3 different sources speaking in favor of Morgan using this tactic. The next day, the final castle surrendered without a fight, and Portobelo had been conquered. Leading citizens were tortured to reveal their valuables, and Morgan sent a letter in perfect Spanish to the president of nearby Panama, demanding a ransom of 350,000 pesos. The president responded by calling Morgan a corsair, and saying that a vassal of the King of Spain would not negotiate with inferior persons. He had assembled an army of 800 and was currently marching to relieve Portobelo. Morgan responded with the following: "Although your letter does not deserve a reply, since you call me a corsair, nevertheless I write you these few lines to ask you to come quickly. We are waiting for you with great pleasure, and we have powder and ball with which to receive you. If you do not come very soon, we will, with the favor of God and our arms, come visit you in Panama. Now it is our intention to garrison these castles, and keep them for the King of England, my master, who since he had a mind to seize them, has also a mind to keep them. And since I do not believe that you have sufficient men to fight with me tomorrow, I will order all the poor prisoners to be freed, so that they may go to help you." Never call Morgan a corsair. His feelings might be hurt. Now, according to Exquemelin, the letter was accompanied by a pistol, which Morgan had allegedly used in the conquest of Portobelo. Morgan promised that he would let the president keep it for 12 months, after which Morgan would go to Panama and retake it. True or not, Morgan's threats did suffice. After the Spanish reinforcements were bogged down in the jungle, the president ordered a retreat. Morgan was paid a ransom of 100,000 pesos and departed triumphantly, returning to Port Royal on the 27th of August, 1668. It mustn't be understated just how successful the raid on Portobelo was. Morgan amassed a total of £75,000, more than 7 times the annual value of the island's sugar exports. Every man was paid at least £60, 2 or 3 times the annual plantation wage, though most of them spent it quickly on vice and debauchery. It still contributed to Morgan's grandiose reputation. His forays were not without consequences, and as soon as the Spanish received reports of the attacks on Cuba and Portobelo, they angrily clamored to the English government. They claimed that Morgan had broken the peace treaty between them and that Modiford was to blame, having sanctioned the attacks. The English, on the other hand, largely believed the raids to be a defensive measure, and some, like the aforementioned George Monk, who saw the Buccaneers as a hard and heavy stick with which to prod and dislodge the Spanish. Monk was a staunch imperialist. Even then, the Buccaneers and their allies were becoming troublesome, and the noose was tightening around them. Bearing the title of Admiral, Morgan had become the second most important man in Jamaica. Though the governor claimed to have started Morgan's campaigns out of defensive interests, he was likely starting to see the economic benefits as well. A share of Morgan's plunder was given to the king and the Jamaican government, and the Buccaneers usually spent the rest of their earnings in the establishments of Port Royal, stimulating the economy. Modiford made the brilliant move of instituting a small liquor tax, which rendered him significant revenue since the Buccaneers drank so much. The two of them started planning Morgan's next excursion shortly after his return. Naturally, they would call it a defensive measure. Morgan was also pressed by his own men, most having wasted their fortunes as quickly as they had made them. Modiford's incessant pleading to the home government had finally made him send over a well-armed frigate, the Oxford, and the governor decided to offer its command to Morgan. The heavy firepower of this new flagship would allow the admiral to assault Cartagena, one of the richest and most heavily defended cities of the Spanish Main. It was believed that Cartagena could be used as a staging ground for a retaking of Jamaica. Unfortunately, the moment that Morgan received the Oxford, she blew up while he and his officer corps were having dinner. Morgan survived by being seated at the far end of the table, and was blasted out of the window. Though Exquemelin put the blame on a traitor seeking revenge on Morgan, eyewitnesses seem to agree that it was caused by an accident. The Spanish, on the other hand, attributed the explosion to divine intervention, especially the inhabitants of Cartagena, who believed it had been caused by their patron saint, the Nuestra Señora de la Popa. According to a legend related to us by William Dampier, himself a buccaneer, the saint had come home that night, her clothes wet and dirty. The loss of the Oxford made many of his men desert him, and with less fire and manpower, Morgan had to select an easier target. His force had now dropped from 8 to 500 men. One of his French crewmen voted for Lake Maracaibo and the prosperous settlements along its coasts, which he had attacked a few years prior under François l'Olonnais. Morgan agreed. The only problem was that Maracaibo posed no threat to Jamaica, meaning that Morgan's primary incentive was profit, not defense. In March of 1669, Morgan and his men closed in on Lake Maracaibo, and found the entrance fortified by a new castle since Olonnais' attack. Despite being defended by only 9 men, they gave fierce fire to the approaching attackers, and when the assault began, they escaped. But not before leaving a surprise behind. They had set a trail of powder to blow up the magazine, and according to legend, it was Morgan himself who discovered and extinguished it. Morgan proceeded to sabotage the fort, before continuing to the town of Maracaibo, located close to the entrance of the lake. Any attempt at mustering a militia had failed, and most of the denizens had fled. Morgan spent 3 weeks sacking the town and rounding up prisoners from the countryside, torturing them to reveal hidden stashes of loot. When contended, the Buccaneers entered the lake itself and assaulted the town of Gibraltar, bestowing it a similar treatment. By the 17th of April, he and his men had taken their fill of plunder and felt ready to depart. The Spanish had something else in mind. They had sent over a pirate hunting fleet, the Armada de Barlovento, to block the lake exit and bottle up Morgan inside. Although their numbers were roughly even to Morgan's, their ships were larger and better armed. They demanded Morgan's complete surrender, and when he read their report aloud to his men, they swore to fight the Spaniard to the death, rather than to give up their loot. Morgan and his men set to work. They were soldiers first and foremost, not especially proficient seamen, but in this engagement he would display some exceptional tact and creativity. A captured Spanish vessel was turned into a fire ship, essentially a flammable, living missile, and disguised as the Buccaneer flagship. This was done by fitting it with a large flag of England, fake cannons, and wooden dummies made to look like soldiers, with hats, swords, and bandoliers. On the 25th of April, Morgan's fleet set sail. The fireship sailed way ahead of the others, and the Spanish flagship grappled onto and boarded it. The flames soon spread and enveloped both vessels, forcing the admiral and his men to abandon ship. The two smaller vessels panicked and ran towards the reoccupied fort, where they ran aground. Both were set aflame to deny the Buccaneers any prizes, but they managed to rescue one of them. Morgan attempted next to retake the fort, but his assault was easily beaten off. Again, he decided to employ a ruse. By sending rowboats full of men from his ships to land, he made it seem as if he was disembarking troops. In truth, the men were hiding in the boats, and accompanied them as they went back to the ships. Thus expecting an attack by land, the Spanish moved their artillery from the seaside to the land side. This allowed Morgan and his fleet to slip by after nightfall. When the Spanish discovered the ruse, it was too late. Morgan had escaped. In May of 1669, Morgan returned to Jamaica as a hero, but Modiford wasn't too happy. For one, Morgan had failed to attack Cartagena, the original target which actually posed a threat to the island, supposedly at least. He was also getting pressure from the home government, even if Morgan and Modiford had many defenders, and the Buccaneers served as a source of pride. The 1660s had seen England humiliated by the Dutch, London burned down, and the country swept by plague. Victories were few and far between, so Morgan's success in the Caribbean was encouraging to the English people. Nevertheless, Modiford revoked all of the privateers' commissions, Morgan's included. The Spanish would not sit idle. For one, their ambassadors complained incessantly to the English government, demanding Modiford's removal, Morgan's punishment, and reparations. In autumn of 1669, William Godolphin was dispatched to Madrid to negotiate a treaty, in which the Spanish would recognize Jamaica as English, cease all aggression, and accept commerce between the two nations. The anti-Spanish faction received a second blow when George Monk died in early 1670 of dropsy. The pro-Spanish, led by Lord Arlington, managed to sway the opinion of the king. Meanwhile, Morgan spent the rest of 1669 in domesticity. He extended his property by more than 800 acres, clearing the land and using it to grow sugar. Most of the labor force were enslaved Indians and Africans, most of them Spanish-speaking and taken from his plundering forays. With the Minnow River as the boundary of his territory, the land near the village of Chapelton is still apparently called Morgan's Valley. His extended family was powerful, maintaining several marriage alliances, and the landowning class looked up to him as the only man capable of defending the island. However, I think it is somewhat naive to view Morgan's domestic life as peaceful, and wrong to paint a rosy picture of it, considering that he was a slave owner. In the period, slaveholders admitted that the only way of keeping their slaves from revolting was by violently suppressing them, and they lived in constant fear of slave revolts. Their houses were essentially small fortresses, with thick walls, loopholes, and a large armory of firearms, sometimes even cannons. It was impossible to take these buildings without artillery. Slaves could be penalized for the smallest of causes, with punishments ranging from flogging to feeding them feces. The white indentured servants were treated marginally better. At their best, their lives were heavily restricted, forbidden from having romantic relations and such. They could suffer more physical abuse than the black and Indian slaves. Modiford attempted to extend an olive branch to the Spanish colonies. He freed some of their prisoners and sent a friendly message to the governor of Cuba. However, to counter repeated English aggression, the Spanish had decided to employ their own privateers to counter them, often just capturing regular merchants and smugglers. The ship carrying the friendly message was taken by one of these corsairs. Reports now began to surface of Spanish hostility against Jamaica. Though some reports only spoke of aggression against Englishmen, others specified it as Jamaicans. I wonder why. A deposition from William Lane, boatswain of the Arlington, also described Spanish hostility against the French that belonged to Tortuga. Again, I wonder why. Most daring of the corsairs was the Portuguese captain Manuel Rivero Pardal, commissioned by the governor of Cartagena. Commanding his Fama of 14 guns, he descended upon the Jamaican coast, where he ransacked plantations, captured ships, and burned habitations. He sent a personal letter to the Jamaican government, in which he challenged Morgan to come out and face him. The letter reads as follows: I come to seek General Morgan, with 2 ships of 20 guns, and having seen this, I crave he would come out upon the coast and seek me, that he might see the valor of the Spaniards. And because I had no time, I did not come to the mouth of Port Royal to speak by word of mouth in the name of my king, whom God preserve. Modiford and the Jamaican council saw no other option but to direct a new expedition. Morgan mustered his men and mobilized the Port Royal militia, receiving his commission a few days later, in July of 1670. For Modiford, it was a dangerous political move. After the death of Monk, he lacked any friends in the Privy Council. He wrote a desperate letter to Lord Ashley, justifying his actions and hoping to make an ally. Lord Arlington told him to keep the privateers at sea and away from land, and Modiford relayed his orders to Morgan, just as he was mustering his men on Ile à Vache. Morgan's new army was the largest assembled yet. Some say it numbered 1,400, others as many as 2,000. Among them were English and Frenchmen, pirates, soldiers, and militiamen, and old friends of Morgan and new. One of his old allies, John Morris, had gone on a brief excursion to hunt down Pardal. Despite being outgunned, he cornered the Fama and defeated the Spaniards in a pitched battle. Rivero was shot in the neck, causing most of his men to flee. Morris returned to Ile à Vache triumphantly. Rivero's challenge to Morgan had served as a prime motivator for the Buccaneers, and his defeat must have been a grand morale boost. Having gathered provisions, Morgan issued privateering commissions to all of his subordinate captains, and set about drafting his articles. These determined how much every man was to be paid and compensated for injuries, with payment either given in cash or slaves. Item 9 rewards battlefield initiative, with £20 sterling paid to the first man to enter a besieged stronghold, and the same for every grenade thrown inside and ladder fixed to the walls. Morgan and his council decided to target the city of Panama, located on the Pacific coast of the Darien Isthmus. The Buccaneers would have to disembark and march overland to reach it, not too dissimilar from Morgan's Nicaragua campaign. It was a challenge, but well worth it, since Panama served as a depot for silver brought in from South America, and was overall one of the richest cities on the Spanish Main. They departed on the 18th of December, 1670. A few days later, they arrived on the island of Santa Catalina, which Morgan intended to use as a staging ground for his assault on the Darien Isthmus. Evidence points to the garrison surrendering without a fight, and that the Buccaneers agreed to fight a mock battle with them instead, firing loose rounds or into the air. The Spanish did this because they wanted to avoid disgrace from their superiors by making it seem as if they had actually resisted. The Buccaneers collected provisions and guides familiar with the Panama region. Morgan directed Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Bradley to capture Castle San Lorenzo on the river Chagres, together with 3 ships and 470 men. This would prove the most difficult battle of the campaign, with Bradley sustaining 30 casualties, himself included. Nevertheless, the castle had been won, and the rest of the fleet signaled to enter. Now, Morgan was more of a soldier than a sailor. A skilled seaman would have measured the waters or hired a pilot, and whatever or whoever was at fault, his flagship ran aground and several other vessels with it. Most of the provisions were recovered, but 10 men perished. Among the casualties was an alleged witch. This strange character has caught some interest in previous videos and warrants a brief discussion. Sadly, we know next to nothing about the witch. She was only ever mentioned in the deposition of Juan de Lao, a Spanish Indian captured by Morgan as a cook, and he only had the following to say. She was small and old and English, and it was publicly said that she was a witch whom the English had brought along to prophesy for them and through her diabolical arts to advise them what to do. The incident is interesting nonetheless, because it reveals some of the superstitions and beliefs common in the 17th century, and among mariners. The closest parallel I can find is a line from William Dampier, in which he described his captain, Swan, as having an astrologer aboard for telling the future. Morgan proceeded upriver in a fleet of small boats and canoes. Although they found some entrenchments, the defenders had pulled back upon seeing the size of Morgan's army. When the river became difficult to navigate, the army made landfall and marched through the harsh terrain, hacking their way forward by blade. To make it easier, Morgan decided to abandon their provisions, believing he could live off the land. However, the noisome advance scared off all the game, and the Spanish burned their storehouses. The invaders had soon been reduced to a starving rabble, forced to eat leather from stolen sacks. Luckily, there was plenty of good water to be had from the many rivers of the country. Less fortunate were the many ambushes prepared by native archers, but by having the flanks and front protected by skirmishers, Morgan's army could easily repel them. After 5 difficult days, they finally came upon the Pacific coast, finding horses and cattle, butchering and devouring them barely cooked. Allowing his men a few hours of rest, Morgan then proceeded to the city of Panama. When the tiled roofs and spires came within view, the men threw their hats in the air, and Morgan ordered them to set up camp and rest for the night. The Spanish were in a bad position. Their ambushes had failed, the city had no walls, and the governor lay ill with fever. The only remaining option was to pray for victory and beat the pirates in the open field outside of the city. Civilians and religious folk were evacuated along with the treasures of the city and with all of the boats and ships. Don Juan, commander of the Spanish forces, had mustered 1,200 infantrymen, mostly poorly trained militiamen, only 600 armed with short-range arquebuses, most with lances and melee weapons, and many of them drunk on the day of the battle. 300 or so were white Spaniards, the rest black or colored. Though the city had 3 cannons, Don Juan did not bring them out for whatever reason, and his biggest asset were the 2 troops of 200 horsemen each. Having initially camped on a hill, he moved his army out on the flat plain, where he believed the cavalry would be more useful, and where the footmen could see him on his horse. They were deployed in a single line 6 ranks deep, with the cavalry on the flanks. Morgan's army was divided into squadrons of 300 men, each flying a green banner with a white dot corresponding to the squadron's number. The vanguard, primarily consisting of Hispaniola hunters, was led by Lawrence Prince and John Morris, behind whom came Morgan's right wing, and Edward Collier's left wing. The rear guard was led by a newcomer, Colonel Bledry Morgan, no relation. Henry Morgan sent the vanguard to take the undefended hill, hoping to use it to outflank the enemy. Don Juan saw this and sent his cavalry forward to disperse them. But the hunters were expert sharpshooters, and each man picked off one of the leading horses, forcing the rest to wheel right and out of danger. With the hill conquered, the right and left wing swung towards it. As they disappeared into a gully, some of the eager Spaniards thought they were running from the field, and eagerly charged without orders. Excitement soon spread across the ranks, with the officers unable to control them. Don Juan decided to seize the moment and joined his men in the wild charge. It was then that the right and left wing came down the hill, and seeing the Spaniards charging them, gave a single, devastating volley. About 100 Spaniards dropped, and excitement was exchanged for panic. They turned their backs and ran. Some officers tried shooting their own men, but it was no use, and Don Juan, who lingered for a while, was soon convinced to retreat. A few men turned around to fight again, but were swiftly dispatched by the Buccaneers' fire. The Spanish made a last-ditch effort to repel the enemy, when they sent a stampede of cows against them. The sharpshooters picked off the herders, and the cows were soon forced to turn, retreating along with the mass of Spaniards. Following in hot pursuit, the Buccaneers drew their cutlasses and hacked down any laggards. By 9 a.m., they had lost 15 of their own, as 400 or 500 Spanish bodies littered the field. It was a devastating victory. The Buccaneers rushed into the city, where they met some minor resistance from barricades and defenders in the street. However, these soon retreated, and the cannons were found to be spiked. Not long after, a series of explosions were heard. Fleeing citizens could be heard shouting, "Fuego! Fuego!" as militiamen ran from building to building with burning torches. Panama was burning. Now, Exquemelin alleges that Morgan himself set the city ablaze, likely as a move to smear the admiral and portray him as antagonistic. In truth, both Spanish and English eyewitnesses agree that it was the Spanish who had done it. In a previous video I said it was upon the orders of the governor, but in his own words, it was the owners of the houses. However, he gleefully commented on the Buccaneers fretting over their loss of plunder, and the fire allowed him and his men to organize and escape. And therefore, he might have hidden the order in his report to avoid pissing off his superiors. Morgan still held him responsible. Morgan stood to earn nothing from burning the city. He could not ransom what was already destroyed, nor plunder anything taken by the flames. He sent out Robert Searles to capture the denizens and their treasures, but they got drunk and distracted by a group of women, allowing the riches to abscond. A few meager troves were taken, some excavated from the scorched ruins, but it was not enough to satisfy his men. He seems to have made around 70,000 pounds, 5,000 less than the Portobelo raid, which had been completed with only 500 men, and now had to be divided among 4 times as many. It is difficult to say how the Buccaneers felt about the expedition. Exquemelin's claims of them feeling cheated seems a bit too dramatic. If they truly had felt so, his life might have been in jeopardy. Even though the attack had rendered next to no booty, he had still preserved most of their lives and brought them success on the battlefield. And it's not like they had made no money either. Even if they only earned 1/3 or 1/4 of the Portobelo shares, it was still much more than they could make from honest work. In the future, veterans of Panama would speak fondly of Morgan, and as late as the 1720s, pirates were inspired by his deeds on land and sea. However, most of the Buccaneers did leave his service to go and find their own fortunes, and he returned to Jamaica with only 3 ships out of the initial 36. If he planned a second campaign, he would have needed a repeat of Portobelo, a small force taking a large booty, thus drawing more recruits to him. It is purely speculative. Panama was Morgan's last campaign, and a few months after returning, he was arrested. On the 18th of July, 1670, William Godolphin had successfully agreed to a treaty with the Spanish. Although there were no mentions of mutual trade, the treaty did confirm peace between the two nations, with Spain recognizing Jamaica as rightfully English. This was radical, since Spain had held for almost 200 years that all of the Americas were theirs, giving them a reason to ban outsiders or otherwise arrest them. The treaty was ratified in England on the 18th of November, and when news of Morgan's attack reached London in February of 1671, the king issued orders for the arrest of Morgan and Modiford. Charles II had a complicated relationship with the Buccaneers. They were nominally anti-Spanish and anti-Catholic, whereas Charlie had spent his exile in the courts of France and Spain. The Spanish had supported his claim to the throne, and in return, he promised to end their war with England. He was married to a Portuguese Catholic and rumored to be one himself. Upon his death, his brother and heir was deposed after openly converting. However, he knew that his subjects were Protestants, and he did receive a welcome share of the Buccaneers' plunder. Some believe that he purposefully delayed sending news of the treaty to Jamaica until Morgan had returned, so that Morgan's attack could be justified by saying, oh, he didn't know of the treaty, and that the scandal caused by the attack was unexpected, and compelled the order of arrest. Nevertheless, Morgan had broken the treaty after it had been signed, and without any strong anti-Spaniards in the current council, he sealed the deal. A few years prior, Modiford had discharged a council member named Thomas Lynch. A veteran of the Western design that captured Jamaica, Lynch was a proponent of peace and commerce with the Spaniard. Although he still owned a plantation on the island, his discharge had made him leave for London. Now the king had him promoted to lieutenant governor, with orders to arrest both Morgan and Modiford, and to rule in the absence of the latter. As you might have picked up, one of the big issues was the speed of communication. Letters and orders to and from London could take months depending on the weather, since they had to be delivered by ship. Modiford further argued that, since the Spanish were constantly hostile and knocking on his door, he couldn't just sit idle with a thumb up his ass for months waiting for official orders. He had to act quickly. And even if he had received the orders to recall Morgan and his men, it was unlikely that they would just have stood down. Buccaneers kind of did whatever they wanted, and both Morgan and Modiford had to play by their rules if they wanted anyone to defend Jamaica. Morgan was already wealthy after completing his first campaign, and in truth, his subsequent expeditions might purely have been done to defend his existing interests, rather than to expand them. That was just a nice bonus. In all likelihood, he considered both. Modiford received Lynch cordially, the latter not immediately informing the governor of his arrest, partly due to suffering from gout. After 5 weeks of staying at Modiford's house, he invited him aboard his ship, where he promptly announced the arrest. Considering Modiford's hospitality, it might be seen as especially deceptive. But it wasn't unheard of for deposed governors to dispute their arrests and even initiate civil conflict. Luckily, Jamaica avoided any such strife, even though Modiford was popular with the general public. The governor was shipped overseas and locked in the Tower of London. Unfortunate. Morgan's arrest was actually delayed, because he caught a bug on the Panama campaign and lay ill with fever for several months. Lynch respected this and referred to Morgan as an honest, brave fellow. And although he admitted to the privateers having committed diverse barbarous acts, he blamed these on Morgan's vice admiral, Edward Collier. Lynch also struggled to arrest Morgan owing to new rumors of a Spanish invasion, this time fueled by the attack on Panama. His solution was to fortify the island on credit and try to keep the Buccaneers close to home. By arresting Morgan, he might scare them off. However, he succeeded in doing that after arresting and executing several captains who had committed piracy after his arrival, much to his own dismay when war broke out with the Dutch. Again, now he had no privateers for the island's defense and begged for England to send him naval support, which they didn't. It didn't help that Jamaica was hit by drought and then a hurricane, ravaging the local economy. He continuously requested money from the council, but they refused him. A few months prior, Morgan had finally been arrested and shipped over to England, arriving in July of 1672. However, he never spent any time in prison and was allowed to live at his own expense. Considering his money made from plundering and planting, it must have been comfortable enough. This was a result both of Morgan's friends and political circumstances. Regarding politics, the war against the Dutch was not looking good at sea, while the supposed French allies were making advancements on land. Fear was now rising that France, a Catholic country, would rule the entire coast south of England. With the king passing laws in Catholic favor, religious sentiment was rising against him. England was in need of a hero and a distraction. His most prominent friend was the son of George Monk, Christopher, a confidant of the king himself. He invited Morgan to social events, where the sunburned swashbuckler was viewed with intrigue in an otherwise mundane court, pierced on occasion by bad news from the front. Morgan could relay stories of English victories on the Main, and was soon viewed with both respect and admiration. With Lynch clearly struggling with the policy of Jamaican defense, and multiple figures speaking fondly of Morgan, it didn't take long for the king to consult him directly. In July of 1673, he was asked to submit a memorandum for what was to be done about the island's defense. Morgan suggested 20 large iron guns to supply the Port Royal batteries, and a fifth-rate frigate to take him back to Jamaica. The king was so impressed by the entire document that he invited Morgan over to meet him. He was later presented with a snuff box bearing the king's profile done in small diamonds. The meeting was followed by an informal hearing, in which Morgan was essentially cleared of all charges. He proved that he did not know of the treaty, that his act of war was done to end a war, and when asked why he did not believe the Spaniards when they told him of the peace, he simply said that the Spanish are liars. The hearing ended with a laughter, and Morgan's name had been cleared. The next year, the king ordered Governor Lynch to be recalled, replaced by Lord Vaughan, with Henry Morgan as lieutenant governor. But before leaving, the king himself had Morgan knighted, titling him Sir Henry Morgan. This naturally outraged the Spanish, but may have served as a warning to them. They had recently begun another campaign of colonial counter-piracy, and the English backtracked on Lynch's policy of anti-privateering, deciding instead to sponsor it in a more limited fashion. If English ships or possessions were attacked, Jamaica was to respond accordingly. The knighthood essentially told them, if you don't behave, we'll get more Morgans. In 1676, Captain Thomas Rogers was sailing in a small ship along the Hispaniola coast. Possessing a French commission, he was prowling for Spanish prizes. Deciding to make a stop at Ile Avache, he was surprised to find a shipwreck, and none other than his former commander, Harry Morgan. On his way back to Jamaica, Harry had been shipwrecked along with the supplies for the island's defense. Lowering his French flag and hoisting the English, Rogers escorted his former captain back to the Blue Island. Upon his arrival, Lynch was promptly deposed, and Morgan instituted as ruler of the island. The true governor, Vaughan, had yet to arrive. His family was no doubt glad to see him, and his first days were spent celebrating. Then, it was time to get to work. The new governor was welcomed graciously, the militia whipped into shape, the fortifications refurbished. He eventually oversaw the construction of 2 new forts, these inspired by his own experiences of siege warfare on the Spanish Main. However, Vaughan was not fond of Morgan, and was doing everything in his power to see him removed. To this end, he even made an ally with the disliked Lynch. Lynch had recently sold some 500 slaves captured from the Dutch. This was nothing out of the ordinary, but the king had not received his share of the profits. Though Vaughan initially used it as a point against Lynch, the two eventually came to some agreement, with Vaughan commending Lynch and his previous government. One could suspect corruption. Vaughan accused Morgan of being a drunkard who spent most of his time in the taverns and gambling halls. But Vaughan wasn't especially popular. In England, Samuel Pepys called him one of the lewdest fellows of the age. One of Vaughan and Morgan's biggest disputes came in regards to privateering. England was now at peace with all of her neighbors, and Vaughan wanted to enforce it. English privateers were still operating under French commissions and selling their prizes and plunder at Jamaica, much to his dismay. One of these ships was taken and the captain made to stand trial. The court consisted of Morgan and Bindless. The case was dismissed. You see, Morgan stood to personally profit from the privateers. He recommended them to the French governor of Saint-Domingue, himself a former buccaneer, and Morgan received a slice of their profits. Vaughan eventually outlawed Englishmen from sailing under foreign commissions and even pursued a full investigation of Morgan's affairs. His popularity shrank farther when he hanged a privateer captain without the council's consent. This privateer had committed piracy, but the council wanted to be cautious and not scare away the rest of them, since they still relied on them for defense. Vaughan was not popular. He generally behaved like a tyrant and was seen as a puppet of the Royal African Company. Many of his decisions against smugglers and privateers were made to ensure their monopoly on the slave trade, whilst unable to fully meet the demands of the plantations. Eventually, the home government replaced him. He departed the island in 1678, but not before cutting Morgan's salary from an annual £600 to £300. His replacement, Lord Carlisle, was more agreeable to Morgan. Morgan's life was now looking stable and peaceful. He had expanded his possessions to become one of Jamaica's biggest landholders. His extended family was growing, though he would not produce any kids of his own. It isn't entirely certain why. Perhaps infertility on the part of the husband or wife, and there are no clues to Morgan having an active sexual life. Although he was described as growing fat in his 40s and being an avid drinker, frequenting the taverns and sitting up late, his critics never mentioned any adultery or deviance. It isn't especially odd to talk about this either, since buccaneers were known for their rampant sexuality, and 17th century biographies generally being scandalous, or at least pierced by litters of children. Today it is quite common for couples to agree on childlessness for a multitude of reasons, but this wasn't the case back in the period, especially for aristocrats who wanted to continue their personal bloodlines. It was an incredibly important point of pride. Nor did they have the same access to preventing pregnancy as we have, meaning that an active sex life in a couple would usually lead to children, unless if there was something going on. So Morgan stands as a curious example, both among aristocrats and buccaneers. Throughout the 1670s, Morgan was still making deals with privateers sailing under French commissions, but he was increasingly growing hostile. It was a slow development. There was this one incident where the Bishop of Santa Marta was captured by privateers and taken to Jamaica, where the governor allowed him residence until he could return. Morgan decided to show him courtesy by offering him pontifical robes, which he had stolen from Panama some 8 years prior. His residence and Jamaica as a whole was likely rife with such items. Apparently, St. Paul's Cathedral on the island still houses a silver chalice taken from the Great Raid and donated by Morgan. Hostility towards the Buccaneers mostly came from trade and plantation interests. His estate needed indentured labor, but many of them escaped to join Buccaneer crews. Jamaican commerce with the Spanish was growing, since Jamaican goods were much cheaper than those imported from Spain. Buccaneers were then actively harming these attempts at peaceful trade, and Morgan's allies and home government were continuously pressing him about it. By 1680, he and the council forbade Jamaican privateers from sailing under foreign commissions against any nation that England was at peace with. Getting lost through was no problem, since Carlisle had left for England, effectively making Morgan the governor, and its most powerful by far. The people respected him, his brother-in-law Bindless was Chief Justice, he was friends with the other council members, and his cousin served as commandant. A member of the assembly, Roger Elliotson, would later call this period the Golden Age. Morgan had developed into a true enemy of pirates. He called for frigates to assist him in the removal, and in 1681 he sent a small expedition to capture a notorious Dutch pirate, Jacob Everson, who was executed upon orders from London. In 1682, he even executed multiple members of Bartholomew Sharp's Pacific adventure. Sharp was a proud veteran of Panama and outspoken supporter of Morgan, and the men condemned were possibly as well. Still, Morgan could not help but be impressed by Sharp's ability in sailing around Cape Horn. Indeed, much of Morgan's anti-piracy actions were part of a publicity campaign. Charles II was to be succeeded by the Duke of York, the principal investor in the Royal African Company. By targeting pirates and their illegal slave trade, Morgan could signal his loyalty to the coming king. However, it didn't help too much. Voices at court were accusing Morgan of not doing enough against pirates. Ironic, considering that the king pardoned Bartholomew Sharp, whose crew had been personally condemned by Morgan. These whispers had been instigated by Lynch and Vaughan, who were doing their utmost to get back in power. When Morgan tried defending himself against the accusations, he implicitly recognized the allegations. Their next move was to assist Captain Francis Mingham, a brandy smuggler arrested by Morgan for not declaring his goods. Under the oversight of Lynch and Vaughan, Mingham was absolved and Morgan portrayed as the villain. With support from the Spanish ambassador, Lynch was appointed as the new governor in 1682, with the additional order to remove Morgan from his position as lieutenant governor. Morgan accepted the order with surprising humility, but indicated in a letter that he was responsible for much of the current prosperity. He still maintained a seat on the council, and with the support of his allies, there was still hope of him reclaiming his position of power through political intrigues. However, Morgan had lost much of his once powerful aura, largely owing to his alcoholism, and he was seen as a figurehead of his political party, known as the Loyal Club. With a change of politics in England, this party would become the local Tories, staunchly pro-monarchy and fanatically Protestant. They primarily consisted of Jamaican planters, and their power had diminished with the growth of the merchant class, significantly empowered after the expanded trade with Spain. Lynch was much in favor of smuggling. These merchants largely descended from the Cromwellian Old Standers, and they would become the local Whigs. In some ways, Morgan was a relic of the old days. His policy had revolved around sugar planting and national defense. By now, the sugar industry was well established, and the island was well defended. There wasn't much more to do but expand commercial interests, which doesn't seem to have been Morgan's forte. This probably played a big role in his ousting from the government. He simply wasn't relevant anymore. Nor was he especially interested in politics and public life. He spent his days managing the estate and his nights in Port Royal, going from tavern to tavern. Often drunk, he was known for making loud comments on whatever was on his mind. In one particular rant, he apparently cursed the assembly. After one of his relatives started a drunken riot, Morgan was caught in a string of convoluted intrigues, resulting in a suspension from the council, ending his public life. The Tories were subsequently purged of his supporters. Lynch had won, but didn't get much time to celebrate. During his Atlantic crossing, he and his entire family had contracted some unknown disease. His wife had died and he was currently dying, and it's kinda sad that he spent the last months of his life on political intrigues, though he did get married a month before dying, to a 17-year-old. He was 81. Her widowed hand was then taken by Lynch's lieutenant governor and successor, Henry Molesworth, agent of the slave-trading Royal African Company, and generally disliked by everyone. Winding back the clock a bit, in 1678, one of Morgan's old crewmen, Alexander Exquemelin, published a Dutch account of his time under Morgan. It didn't exactly portray the Admiral or his Buckies in a positive light. Indeed, the book, The Buccaneers of America, was as much a critique of them as it was of imperialism overall. It was eventually translated into Spanish, and in 1683, with all of its condemnations of the English, was translated into English. 2 editions were published by William Crook and Thomas Malthus. These 2 editions were wildly different. Crook chose to translate the Spanish edition, including all the horrific deeds allegedly committed by Morgan, whether true or not. However, he also attempted to justify these crimes and glorify the Buccaneers. Some have described his behavior as schizophrenic. Others believe that he was practicing satire on a 4D level. Satire was surely the goal of Thomas Malthus, who started drawing parallels between the Buccaneers and Greek legends, while simultaneously exaggerating their criminal deeds and atrocities, seemingly to hammer home Exquemelin's initial point of critiquing colonialism, by highlighting the absurdity of celebrating the Buccaneers as heroes, while also recognizing the inherent brutality of their work. Both Crook and Malthus included illustrations of Morgan, which you have now seen throughout the video. We do not know if Morgan looked like this. I haven't found any reliable descriptions of him, only that he was described as being tall and bearded in Dudley Pope's 1978 biography of him. Anyway, Crook's Morgan is seen with a rather stern expression, standing against a destructive background of battlefields and burning ships. It is quite fitting for a villain. Malthus's Morgan, clearly based on Crook's image, looks kinder and softer, standing not against some violent backdrop, but a neat pictured frame. This is contrasted by Malthus' depictions of other pirates, all scowling and brandishing weapons. Again, likely done for the sake of satire. Look how nice he is, and then you start reading what he apparently did. Morgan was not happy. It is not certain how many lies and exaggerations Exquemelin made of Morgan, but he seemed to have taken the biggest offense to his portrayal as an indentured servant. Some modern historians have agreed with Morgan, but I find that the strongest documented evidence we have points to Morgan having been indentured. I haven't found enough evidence of him partaking in the Western design. A subsequent edition of Buccaneers was published by Philip Aries. It also included Basil Ringrose's account of Sharp's Pacific adventure, the same adventure Morgan had condemned. Suffixed was a new account of Morgan's Panama raid, included to redeem Morgan, who Aries called an incomparable soldier and sailor. PA goes on to explain that Morgan wasn't an indentured servant, but descended from an honorable family and went with a Western design to Hispaniola and Jamaica. There is no mention of Morgan having served in the design as an officer, so perhaps he had done so as a regular footman, which might be why we have no other documentation of it. Morgan decided to sue Crook and Malthus for libel. In February of 1685, his attorney, John Green, defended Henry Morgan during a hearing, in which he said the following: "Against all evil deeds, piracies, etc., the Morgan family had the greatest abhorrence and disgust, and that in the West Indies there are such thieves and pirates, called Buccaneers, who subsist by piracy, depredation, and evil deeds of all kinds, without lawful authority, that of these people Henry Morgan always had, and still has, hatred." Malthus paid a fine of £200 and never published a second edition of the history of the Buccaneers. Crook, on the other hand, was not required to pay any money, since he wrote a lengthy apology to Morgan and published a second edition, attempting to correct the alleged errors. His apology is, again, rather confusing. He repeats his celebration of Morgan's heroism and fails to understand how this heroic portrayal is contradicted by the horrid details of the narrative, even as he goes on to list and retract several of these cruelties on Morgan's request. Morgan's lawsuit would have no substantial impact on his reputation in the long term. Subsequent editions of the book just copy the first editions, ignoring the corrections made after the lawsuit. He won the lawsuit but lost the battle over his legacy, and is largely remembered as a cruel pirate, not an honorable privateer. Some historians have attempted to redeem his reputation by pointing out the falsities in Exquemelin's account, and claiming that Morgan was entirely justified. It is true that Morgan acted under a commission and Modford's orders and the national interests of Jamaica, but he also defied those orders when he assaulted targets that didn't pose a threat. Maracaibo had been devastated by Olonais some 3 years before Morgan, and was in no position to threaten faraway Jamaica. It seems to have been done to enrich himself, his investors, and to appease the unruly Buccaneers. To some extent, the same can be argued for Portobelo. Morgan attacked Portobelo because he didn't get enough loot from the Principe raid, and he didn't know that the dungeons of Portobelo were full of English prisoners. That was a justification in hindsight. And that's not to mention his first campaign in Mexico and Nicaragua, which was done without a commission and flat-out piracy, or his capture of the Dutch ship in 1661. Morgan's attorney said in 1685 that the admiral detested pirates and buccaneers, and Morgan took offense to the Panamanian president calling him a corsair. But the crimes of his early career and the dubious decisions of his height are undisputable. However, in the context of the 17th century, Morgan should not be seen as an anomaly. Morgan's actions were largely a repeat of Christopher Ming's Caribbean campaigns, with Ming's being as, if not more dubiously legal than Morgan. However, Ming's is nowadays remembered as a naval officer, not a pirate or buccaneer, and celebrated by his own portrait after fighting the Dutch. Ransoming cities, abusing prisoners, and torturing civilians for loot was part and parcel of military doctrine in the period, especially with mercenary farces, whom the Buccaneers appear reminiscent of. In some ways, Buccaneers and figures like Morgan have become scapegoats for a wider trend in the century and before, even if it was on its way out. As for criminal behavior and profiteering, corruption was openly detested, but a casual fact of everyday politics. We might remember how Morgan profited from piracy, but not how many kings and princes benefited from it likewise. There is of course the moral question. Morgan might not have been entirely legal, but was he in the right? If he hadn't gone on aggressive campaigns, would Jamaica have been retaken by the Spanish? There were consistent rumors in the 1660s that Spain was planning an invasion. Looking back, we know today that it was all hearsay. There were no serious plans for a reconquista. But to Morgan and Modiford, it was far from certain. And going on the offense to acquire intelligence, hostages, destroy mustering points and acquire provisions for defense was a sound strategy. However, these offensive tactics spawned a vicious cycle in which the Spanish retaliated, capturing English ships and maltreating the captives. Panama was a response to Spanish piracy, which was a response to English piracy, and so the bloody wheel kept spinning, and would go on spinning. And in spite of the Treaty of Madrid in 1670, English buccaneers like Sharp would continue their attacks on the Spanish, leading to more retaliations, justifying more retaliations. The cycle can be traced back to Spanish economic policy and their ban on all foreign trade and trespassing into the Americas, seen as theirs alone. The other Europeans saw no other option but to use smuggling and piracy to get a grip on New World riches. Was that really moral? Henry Morgan did defend Jamaica, but what was Jamaica? Jamaica was a ruling clique of pirates and plantation aristocrats who made their money from stealing, murdering, and enslaving. The island became the crown jewel of the early British Empire, but at what cost? It was a fortune built on the backs of chained Africans, Native Americans, Irish, and Scotsmen, whose bones have now turned to dust in the shadow of the Blue Mountains. These were not the romanticized pilgrims and pioneers of North America. Everyone in the Caribbean was a pirate, and there was nothing pretty about it. They saw the filth of Spanish colonialism and decided to wrestle in the mud with them. Charles II perished in 1685, and upon hearing of his father's death, his illegitimate son, James Scott, crossed over from the Low Countries to claim his birthright. Better known as the Duke of Monmouth, and known for his Monmouth Rebellion, he was soundly defeated by the aforementioned Christopher Monk. Having now earned the new king's favor, he was granted the coveted governorship of Jamaica, where he sought to reinstate his old friend Morgan as lieutenant governor. The Duke was very surprised to see Harry Morgan so radically changed. An accompanying doctor, Hans Sloane, gave a vivid description of the old admiral. He was lean and sallow-colored, his eyes yellowish, and though he had no appetite, his paunch protruded heavily. His legs were swollen, he vomited in the mornings and belched throughout the days, largely confining him to naps in the hammock. This prevented him from sleeping at night, when he usually sat up drinking heavily. Morgan was suffering from dropsy, also known as edema, a buildup of fluid in the body's tissue. Sloane tried to recommend a treatment, but Morgan did not continue with it for especially long, and his health continued to deteriorate. Owing to the climate and tropical diseases, it was common for New World men to die in their 50s. Morgan was now 53, and he knew that death stood at the door. By the middle of June, he brought in an attorney and wrote his will. He passed his estate on to his wife. It was valued at £5,236 and included 122 slaves. Colonel Thomas Ballard was given a green saddle. Roger Elliotson, the choice of any one of my horses, my blue saddle and furniture thereunto belonging, together with 1 case of pistols, tipped with silver. His sister, Catherine Lloyd, was to receive £60 annually, to be managed by his cousin, Thomas Morgan of Tredegar. His godsons and his nephew were each left a silver-hilted sword and mourning ring, the nephew additionally receiving another case of pistols, tipped with silver. Even though he never had any children of his own, it should be apparent that Morgan had a large and loving family. And this was perhaps the greatest success of his life. He was still kicking in early 1688 when a letter arrived to Jamaica, confirming his reinstatement to the Jamaica Council. Monk and Morgan's supporters rejoiced, and they soon won an overwhelming victory in the local election. Elliotson published a testimony in which he called Morgan's years of rule the Golden Age, and denouncing the governorship of Lynch and Molesworth. Morgan didn't actually get much done in his final days of government. It is unknown how many meetings he actually attended, aside from the celebration, and he had to be carried there by cart, always walking with a stick. Sloane mentioned how Morgan had temporarily recovered from his ailment, but he soon regressed into his old ways, drinking and developing a swollen belly impossible to conceal. He went through treatment with 4 different physicians. One of them was actually black, but nothing could save him. And after a terrible bout of coughing, Henry Morgan died on the 25th of August, 1688. Bodies rot quickly in the tropical heat, and within less than 24 hours, Monk ordered a state funeral. A larger than usual crowd gathered in Port Royal to watch the procession. Morgan carried in a lead coffin through the stone forts he himself had constructed. The navy ships in the harbor fired a 22-gun salute, 1 more shot than was customary for governors. Within the crowd were a number of pirates. The governor granted them a 24-hour amnesty so that they could attend the funeral of their celebrated hero. The coffin was finally placed on a gun carriage before being ferried into St. Peter's Church, where service was held by Dr. John Longworth, who had accompanied Morgan as a chaplain on his buccaneering raids. The coffin was then buried in the cemetery at the Palisadoes, but has since been lost after Morgan had seen Port Royal grow from a squat on a lickspit to the largest and most bustling city of the great American continent. Though it could now boast of a legal veneer, many pirates having met their end at its noose. The great buildings and alehouses, now tending to so many sailors, smugglers and privateers, could not have been built without the spending of that legendary admiral. The 7th of June, 1692, seemed to be a usual day in the great town of Port Royal. Citizens went about their business, the usual drunks sat in their stools, and dice rolled over gaming boards in smoky rooms, the windows closed to keep out the sun. Seagulls cried, the waves shuddered, the ground rumbled. And so the clock struck 11:43 a.m. If you enjoy this episode, don't forget to give it a like, click the subscribe button and notification bell, and leave a comment with your thoughts on the career of Henry Morgan. YouTube is a bit iffy about notifying you on new releases, even though I upload videos on a weekly basis, sort of. And the best way of receiving them is by joining the Discord server, link in the description. The best way of supporting the channel is by becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. And for as little as $1 a month, you get unlimited, ad-free access to the best pirate content on the tube. Cheers. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.